Hello, wow, been a while, hasn't it? I wrote this after editing the video, but I definitely underestimated this game and how much meat it contains. Because of that, I'll be splitting this video into 2 parts. Part 1 will be focusing mainly on introducing the title to you all, its first few hours in the gameplay, whereas Part 2 will be a lot more story focused. I'd also like to thank my patrons for helping me make this video and keeping this channel alive and well. You're all very cool, and may you all be blessed with the highest gamer score. So yeah, alongside underestimating Lost Odyssey and throwing numerous first drafts of the script in the trash, I think committing to this game was also intimidating due to my childhood memories of it. Going from getting bullied in the schoolyard to being bullied in my bedroom by a goddamn video game. But unlike the schoolyard, when it came to Lost Odyssey, I'd always come back for more. My metaphorical balls ready to be metaphorically crushed by the metaphorical stilettos that dangle lovingly over my metaphorical future children, ready and willing to cause the extinction of the metaphorical Clemps bloodline. Now, if you're a new viewer and you want a little more backstory on the company and man behind Lost Odyssey, I'd suggest watching my Blue Dragon video. It's not necessary, but a little insight into the man, the myth, the legend, notorious Final Fantasy IX enjoyer Hironobu Sakaguchi would only serve to benefit your overall experience. The common sentiment I saw on my Blue Dragon video was people either wanting a remaster of these 2 games or simply confused why we haven't got some sort of PC release. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but unless you own a 360 or a newer Xbox console, you will probably never have the chance to play these again. In a move I understand and respect, it seems like Sakaguchi has little interest in remastering older content in service of pouring resources into new titles. And whilst I respect this, there's still a part of me that feels a little bad for people who've been desperate to play them for the first time. I understand not everybody wants to buy an older 360 model for 2 games, and especially one of the newer consoles. And whilst I hope down to my marrow that we can eventually see a PC port and people can rush to this video to scream how I was wrong and kick sand in my face, for now, I'm just happy to remind people that these existed in the first place. Because if there's anything worse than dying, it's being forgotten. So hopefully, this video will help thrust the game back into whatever size spotlight my viewer base can generate. Because I really think it's worth discussing again. Also, super quick content and spoiler warning before I move on. Spoilers will be present throughout the video in the form of characters, bosses, and story progression. Unfortunately, there's really no helping it with a game like this. And as for the content warning, if any of these topics on screen bother you and you don't want to risk it, I totally understand. Take care of yourselves, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. And so, with that out of the way, let's start talking about the people who made Lost Odyssey possible. Just what is this Odyssey, and how did they lose it? Have they checked under the bed? All this and more, now. To say Lost Odyssey has a cast and crew more varied than a packet of Haribo fucking Star Mix would be underselling it, to say the least. In fact, when you take the time to do surface level research, you come to realize some of them have a bit of a pedigree. The wild thing about this is there are so many people, I'm gonna have to gun through them so this script won't end up competing with the Bayo Tapestry. Obviously, one of the people working on this game is the writer, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and is joined as always by Nobuo Uematsu. This is the duo's second game they worked on together outside of Square Enix. And from what I read and, listened to, it sounds like Uematsu felt more of a fire this time around after Blue Dragon. I'll go into more detail later, but the OST in this game fucks. And it's nice to hear a part of Uematsu's career where he was experimenting with different instruments. I sure hope you're open to the idea of cowbells, because Uematsu isn't asking for your permission. And working alongside Sakaguchi's company, Mistwalker, are the co-developers Feel Plus. For those who don't know, this is a company that was created by Microsoft specifically for the purpose of assisting Mistwalker, and is largely made up of people who worked on the Shadowheart series. They would later go on to assist other projects outside of the company, but it's interesting to see that their conception was a weird bastard child of Microsoft and Mistwalker. Up next on the Lost Odyssey Hall of Fame is Takahiko Inoue, who created the character design. fans. A few of you, I'm sure, are popping the fuck off right now because yes, it is that Takehiko Inoue, creator of such manga classics like Slam Dunk and Vagabond. His involvement in Lost Odyssey might have never been a possibility if it wasn't for the fact that he was a big fan of Kiyoshi Shigematsu, a Japanese best-selling author who worked on the side content of the game's story, for the most part working independently and separate from Sakaguchi's overarching narrative. What makes this more interesting to me is how he'd never worked on a video game project before, let alone writing for the fantasy genre, which makes his involvement all the more fascinating. We also have the talents of J. Rubin. This man translated Kiyoshi Shigematsu's work into English, and his claim to fame is being one of the official English translators for international bestseller Haruki Murakami's novels. Coincidentally, one of my favourite authors. Small world, innit? Finally, to cap it all off, we have a guest appearance from double Emmy Award winner Sheena Easton to sing one song that surprise attacks you out of a fucking bush. So with an all-star cast such as this, a meeting of the minds, some might say. If this project turned out to be a failure, it'll be a pretty embarrassing stain on their resume. How can a room of high-quality chefs fail to cook a single fish finger? How can one YouTuber always fall back on basic bitch food analogies? And thankfully, yeah, this game was a really fantastic addition to an already outstanding JRPG library. Some elements even beat my all-time favourites in terms of their quality. But that isn't to say that everything is perfect. I'd love to sit here and tell you that the game is flawless, but then I'd be lying. But if you're wondering about my recommendation, then I'm here to tell you right here, right now, the game is fantastic and you should play it if you ever have the chance. If we can collectively will a PC release into existence, it doesn't even have to be remastered, then let's try our best. Every like and comment on this video counts towards the spirit bomb. We can do it if we try, gamers. And so, without further ado, let's get on with this video, shall we? To introduce Lost Odyssey, I first have to talk about an event that happened 30 years prior in the game's universe. The discovery of magic energy. This was something that was dormant in all living things until it T-posed menacingly into existence, seemingly out of nowhere. The game's actual introduction to it boils down to an awkward stare-off from across the dining room. It has no idea how this shit happened either, so we're kind of in the same boat here. It follows this up by telling us how this newfound magic energy has affected the world at large, going from people's quality of life, methods of transport, and even affecting how the populace handles war. This is something we see firsthand as we're thrown directly into the bloody conflict between the nation of Kent and the Magic Republic of Ura. This immediately gives you a taste of a world that Lost Odyssey finds itself in. I know you're gonna roll your eyes when I make this comparison, but I do find myself looking at parallels between this intro and Drakengard 1's. The rest of the game is definitely a lot lighter in tone, but the brutality of war here is not underplayed. Every impact a weapon makes feels heavy, both in terms of its animation and the sound effects that accompany it. Soldiers will walk over the corpses of the fallen, and the childlike wonder and mystique of magic is stripped away as you see it being used as nothing more than a resurrection tool, being the only piece of light you'll see on an extremely drab, colourless background. Amongst the chaos of battle, we're introduced to our main character. And if I had a nickel for every game I played where the main character is named Kaim, I'd have 2 nickels. Kaim Arganar is a mercenary currently working for the Republic of Ura. We see him gracefully slice his way through the Kent soldiers as we transition seamlessly from cutscene to gameplay, stopping only to sit back and stare directly into Satan's arsehole as it opens up like the world's worst piñata and showers everyone on the battlefield with an unhealthy dose of liquid hot magma. Kaim is also engulfed in the blast, however he's the only returning survivor of the battlefield. So how exactly did he escape with not a single hair singed on his pretty little head? Kaim is an immortal with a classic lack of memory. And it appears that he's not the only immortal sent to the Highlands, as we bump into a woman named Seth Bolmore, who seems to know Kaim from her past. However, she can't even clarify if this is true because she also suffers from amnesia. Upon making it back to the Republic of Ura, he returns back to report to his master, but instead finds himself thrown in front of a city council, his master coincidentally being a member as well. Now, if you look hard enough, you'll actually spot Kaim's master behind this magnificent set of eyebrows. The man in question is their totally trustworthy and all-round not scumbag, Gongora.
This kind of person. Pathetic. You should be ashamed of who you are and what you've done.
He steps in immediately after the council questions Kaim on how he survived the magical attack on the Highlands by hand-waving the entire situation away. For you see, it was apparently Gongora who placed the spell of immortality on him. This was the first time I raised an eyebrow, if only for the fact that the council are seemingly okay with this answer. There's no questioning Gongora over whether or not this immortality spell can be replicated and placed on their soldiers, since it's apparently so strong it can withstand the tremendous force of an Xbox falling off a shelf. And even after Kaim mentions that he wasn't the only immortal on the battlefield, the council are like, "Oh dope, take her on your next mission then," and sends him out of the door with a slap on the bum. The mission the two immortals have been tasked with is to oversee the progress of Gongora's pet project known as Grandstaff. Don't worry if you're a forgetful person, because the game has your back.
We suspect that a situation at Grandstaff.
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 The Grandstaff.
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 Grandstaff. Grandstaff. Grandstaff. Grandstaff.
Grandstaff.
The reason we're sent to investigate is simple. Grandstaff is a magic research facility that also serves to siphon and store magic energy. And due to the unexplainable meteor incident, some of the council believe this could be due to a leak. The magic energy, with nowhere to go, might have coalesced over the Highlands. And the idea of this happening again is a risk no one but Gongora is willing to take. Because of this, he's put under house arrest and taken off the Grandstaff project, leaving Kaim to meet up with his appointed teammate. Or at least he would if he wasn't introducing himself to the third, unannounced member of their scouting party. You're either gonna love him, or you're gonna hate him. The human embodiment of the horniest jar of Marmite, Jansen Freed. Working as an underling of Gongora to create the hit duo Pokemon Eyelashes and Eyebrows, he's been sent to keep a very literal eye on our two immortals. If he starts to notice either of them regain their memories, he's required to shatter this in order to suppress them. And if confirming at least to us that Gongora is responsible for both immortals' memory loss isn't enough, he's also sticking his nose into the Urin royal family in the form of the Crown Prince Tolton. Now, at this point in the game, all you need to know is the monarchy has been abolished, and Tolton here has more or less come to terms with the idea. He does, however, hold a lot of respect for Gongora, and this is exactly what our bushy little friend wants. You see, his plans go way beyond the completion of Grandstaff, and as we later find out, these are plans that have been 1,000 years in the making. Plans that will slowly unravel as the game continues. Me, Gongora. After all this, Kaim retires to an inn to rest, and when he's resting, he begins to dream. In this dream, we see a young girl standing on a cliff's edge. Kaim hurries to approach her, but she intentionally throws herself over it. I've always loved how this scene was directed. Kaim's pain. We don't just want you to hear it, we want you to feel it, as we see this grief directly through his eyes, putting the focus on his arms and hands, which strike and claw the ground below him as he struggles accepting the truth that was brutally shot into him. As he wearily staggers to his feet, we slowly pan to an unknown woman, blanketing her sobs with her hands. This is the last thing we see as he snaps awake, only to languidly walk out into the city streets below, as if this dream is something he's trying to either live with or walk away from. It's at this point where we're given a little insight into Kaim as a character, and why I ended up loving how they dealt with him. When I first started Lost Odyssey as a kid, I imagined Kaim was going to turn out to be a no-nonsense cool protagonist. And whilst I wasn't exactly wrong in that assumption, there is so much more to Kaim that meets the eye. At this stage in the game, Kaim is hopelessly tired. 1,000 years of memories are lost to him, but they return in the form of dreams. And these are so traumatic that he'd rather his memory remain lost forever. What other memories could return the next night? And could these memories finally be the ones to break him? Yet despite all of this, the game does such a good job at displaying how much of the older Kaim still remains and shows what type of a person he was before his memories were taken from him, being the strict yet caring father figure of the mortals in your party, whilst displaying a keen sense of empathy, where he's willing to display his own weakness to a character who's struggling.
Are you afraid?
Afraid? Yeah, I am. Of course I'd be afraid in a situation like this, and I tell you what, I'd be lying if I wasn't saying that I was scared of you as well.
I'm afraid too.
You're kidding.
And I can't talk about Kaim without mentioning another aspect of the game which builds on his character, or at the very least, his past. Because after being alive for 1,000 years, you'd surely have a lot of stories to tell, and the game treats this very literally. As you adventure through towns and cities, you occasionally run into events that trigger a memory for our protagonist. This is where Kiyoshi Shigematsu comes back into play, and this is where all of his works were compiled. Otherwise known as 1,000 Years of Dreams, these are entirely optional side stories that you can read after sleeping at an inn. And for those of you who've played this game, you'll know that some of these are heavy. And before these videos are over, I'd like to take the time to read you some of them. Not just because I think they're incredibly good reads, but because some of them are actually integral to understanding certain parts of a character's backstory. See, you can choose to skip these and revisit them later, something which I did to save time and record them in bulk. But then out of nowhere, Seth would just bring up a character I had no idea about, and I had to like trawl through footage to find out who the fuck she was referring to.
Who are you?
Turns out, it was in that side story I skipped. Now, this isn't a bad thing, but it does make my job a teensy bit more difficult and expensive. This is where the money's going, Patreon, thank you so much. In a similar way to how I covered Lester DeRosso's past in my Bravely Default video, I'll be cherry picking a few of these to cover in the same style. One of those is more on the heavy side, but I'd say it's important due to being the first dream you encounter. The dream in question is named Hanna's Departure, an undisclosed segment of Keim's 1,000 Years, and I'll be reading an abridged version of the story at the end of the video. So please stick around until then, because a lot of work went into it and I think you'll enjoy it. So moving back onto the main story, Keim first meets up with Seth, the immortal woman he encountered in the carriage. Seth is a character I'll dive into a little more as we discuss her backstory, but for now all you need to know is she's the bee-goat, best girl of all time, actual honest-to-goodness pirate queen, firm believer in the One Piece, and all-round ray of sunshine in contrast to Keim's cloudy demeanor. She also serves as the straight man to Jansen, you know. This guy. Now Jansen is, as previously stated, a bit of a divisive character. This should be made apparent when the first proper introduction we get to him is arriving stone cold drunk first thing in the morning, 3 women draped over him and proudly announcing he spent all of Gongora's prepayment on booze and women's. Seth then pays the girls 1 piece of gold each to have a good day on her.
Such a doll. You come and play with us next time, honey.
And the 2 immortals are left to haul their newfound baggage with them to Grandstaff. As far as where I find myself on the like to dislike spectrum when it comes to Jansen, I find myself here. There were points where I, along with the entirety of the game's cast, found myself saying, shut up, shut the fuck up, Jansen, because my man doesn't have an off switch. He has some of the most impressive bouts of verbal diarrhea I've ever seen in a game of this genre. And normally I'd say this is a bad thing if it wasn't for the fact that 50% of the time he's actually unironically funny.
Oh, hi, I couldn't sleep. I'm usually exercising, sparring with people, and I work out a lot. How about a foot massage? My feet don't stink. Keim, you up for that? Hello? Hey, what's this?
I speak with Her Majesty's voice.
Crap. I say we surprise him by running away.
You, shut up.
Now I can't say if Michael McGarren, voice actor for Jansen and motherfucking Knuckles the Echidna, was told to improvise his lines, because this one-man comedy routine goes on some absolute tangents, and even if some of them didn't land, I can at least respect the energy and charisma that Michael was able to inject into the character. So, the 2 immortals and our hungover young friend make their way to Grandstaff, battling enemies and the elements until they finally find themselves at the base of the facility. The source of the leak is revealed to be parasites that feed off the magical energy released from the pipes. This is also the first enemy to wear those ball-crushing high heels I mentioned near the start. And from what I can gather from Twitter replies, I wasn't the only victim. See, there's a chance you can miss an item that grants you paralysis immunity earlier into the dungeon, and take a wild guess what status effect this fight throws at you. Then to make matters worse, when you finally beat it, the game's like, ooh,
Another one.
so I hope you stocked up on paralyze heals, you silly willy, because this is definitely a skill wall if you don't come prepared. And hey, while we're on the topic, why don't we talk about the gameplay? When it comes to discussing Lost Odyssey's gameplay, the best word for me to use is classic. They aren't trying to win awards for the world's most original turn-based gameplay, and they were never trying to. But what they did do is make sure everything was as neatly polished as they could. And for a hefty majority of the game, I'd say they knocked it out of the park. As mentioned in the beginning with my whole cock and ball torture analogy, this game is an absolute monster when you first start off. If you don't listen to what the game tells you when it comes to in-game systems at play, you'll find yourself a broken, bloody mess on the floor, and the game will not care. It's a trial of fire, for use of a better term. Anyone who can escape it will be gifted with the correct kit to stand toe-to-toe with your enemies when the time comes. And even then, the game can be particularly unforgiving. That's not me complaining, although my SD card surely was after being filled to the brim with the sloppiest mistakes caught on camera since the night of my conception. As for the gameplay itself, it's a standard turn-based affair where everyone's turn is displayed at the bottom of the screen with a heavy focus on timing. Regular attacks are unsurprisingly fairly quick, but if you use an ability or spell, they'll be pushed further back on the queue. The stronger the ability or spell, the more likely it'll be pushed back 2 or 3 turns. Attacking an enemy charging a spell will delay that ability, but keep in mind that the enemy can do exactly the same thing to you, which can utterly ruin your day when one heal can determine whether or not your internal organs become external. A feature that they brought over from Blue Dragon is the quick time event to power up basic attacks. And if you watch that video, you'll know that I wasn't the biggest fan of that due to how long this made certain battles. In Lost Odyssey, the ring system is not much better, but at the very least it's incorporated into the character's attack animation, and failing it will result in slightly less damage dealt. During every regular attack, you'll need to hold down R2 and try your best to connect these 2 rings together. Getting a perfect score will result in higher base damage, and through the ring creation system, you can make specific rings that fit your current criteria in battle. Need to deal with a mechanical boss? Create something that deals more damage to mechanical enemies. Enemies have a lower resistance to wind? Make a ring that applies the wind element to your weapon. Having a particularly bad day at an old folks home? Elden Ring. Rare rings can also be a reward for exploring every nook and cranny of a dungeon, so be sure to keep your eyes open as you progress through them. Next up is your guard condition, which, looking at it with older eyes, is definitely one part of the reason this game was so hard for me when I was younger, because I didn't pay attention to it. Sticking to a traditional JRPG format, your melee characters will be on the front line and your casters at the back, allowing them to take less damage. When an enemy attacks your melee characters, however, your guard condition will drop. The further it drops, the closer the enemy gets to the soft, fleshy insides that lay cowering behind their thick outer shell. Rough translation, your casters take more damage. Thankfully, the game gives you spells which can partially restore your wool, which is good for you and your enemies, because they also have a guard condition meter that you can break. It's a neat little addition that adds an extra layer of strategy during certain fights. Finally, we move on to your method of gaining skills and abilities, and I think this game's way of dealing with this might be one of my favorites, at least in recent memory. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first is one half of it works exactly the same as Final Fantasy IX's system, where an immortal will equip a certain piece of armor with an ability, and the SP you gain afterwards will fill this bar. Once filled, you have the ability permanently. What makes Lost Odyssey unique is it works the whole amnesiac immortal/mortal dynamic that exists within the cast and blends it into the gameplay. Due to the immortals essentially being wiped slates, they have a very basic amount of skills when you first receive them. And this is where the mortals come in. Mortals are able to learn skills by leveling up. Jansen, for example, is a black mage, so you'll learn abilities that correlate to that job. Immortals cannot learn skills in the same way mortals do, but what they can do is learn from the mortals in order to rebuild their lost power. In a similar way to equipment, mortals serve as the immortal's skill tree, and by linking an immortal with a select skill that the mortal has learned, after a few battles they will permanently acquire that skill. Think along the lines of teaching your grandparents how to use the Facebooks, or how Rayman 2 on PC was not installing viruses and was instead someone clicking 5 links claiming they won a trip to the Bahamas, not naming any names, mother. And the more mortals you recruit into your party, the crazier your builds can get. And as hinted at earlier, by endgame, if you're the adventurous type and find some of the hidden spells and weapons, you can create some pretty game-breaking builds. But even with that in mind, there were still multiple moments when the game's difficulty made me sweat. And that wasn't just directed at bosses either. Regular enemies can give you a serious problem if you don't pay attention. Now, whilst there are packs of enemies that are dispatched fairly easily, more often than not, Lost Odyssey is one of those RPGs that try very hard to pit you against opponents that have synergy with one another. Sometimes you'll run into enemies that have a 50-50 split in terms of magical and physical immunity, which means you can't just spam the attack button. Some enemies will focus on the weakest member of your party, which more often than not are your healers, which can force you into a corner very quickly. And all throughout the game, with an exception being the final 2 dungeons due to the aforementioned optional content grind, there were never any points where I felt enemies enemies were either underleveled or overpowered. It's a very consistent level of challenge all the way through, both with bosses and random enemies throughout dungeons. Also, before I move on, I added this last minute because I know I'd kick myself if I didn't include it, but the monster designs in this game are really good. I think aesthetically, Lost Odyssey is by far one of my favourites when it comes to creature and character designs. The intricacy and detail on some of these monsters are seriously fantastic and was something I always looked forward to seeing. When every enemy you face looks like it could be a mini-boss or in some cases a regular boss, it makes exploring new dungeons exciting because you don't know what weird looking enemy they'll throw at you next. Speaking of which, dungeons are what I can only describe as a mixed bag throughout the game. Thankfully, most of them are a fun time, even if they were fairly straightforward with the odd puzzle or two. Nothing too crazy where it feels like you're gonna pull your hair out or anything, at least for the most part. My personal favourites were when they split your party in two with a predetermined selection, forcing you to use characters which you may not use on the regular, which made you use different strategies. The biggest nitpick I have with these is specifically with video game logic. So I know I'm crying over nothing, but the reason you split up in the first place was because one person needs to press the button because the person on the lift can't reach it, and I'm sat there with food dribbling down my bib like, damn, 1,000 years old, you haven't learned to stretch your fucking limbs. Another detriment I felt a lot more in later levels was the fact that Lost Odyssey's lack of a proper dungeon map can throw you for a loop if you're going in for the first time or revisiting it after a few years, as the minimap can only be so helpful. In larger dungeons, this can become a real problem, especially since these dungeons often contain the most puzzles, and these would always end up being the ones I found myself enjoying the least. Find me one child who enjoys getting lost in a Toys R Us. No, seriously, my son has been missing for years at this point. Little fucker owes me 10 quid. But if there's one dungeon that holds my ire stronger than any other, it's the Temple of Enlightenment. Now this dungeon is optional, let me get that out of the way real quick, but it's necessary if you want to get one of your party's best weapons and a secret spell. It's also a fantastic place to grind. One trip through the dungeon and back can get you from the 50s to the 70s in terms of level, and this should be scaring you right now. The best way I can describe the Temple of Enlightenment is it's effectively a giant colourless Rubik's Cube. You run around the maze, always at risk of random encounters, until you find a switch, at which point certain platforms will spin up, down, left or right, and I promise when I say I tried my best at the first room. But by that point I was 40 hours into the game and didn't have time to get lost for an hour. So I consulted a guide. From start to finish, including a guide, this dungeon took approximately 2 hours 35 minutes. And whilst that may not sound like much, keep in mind I was trapped in the first room for over an hour without being able to beat it. There are, give or take, at least 3 of these rooms with various unconnected hallways with their own individual puzzles. I shudder to imagine how long it would be if I went in completely blind. Then, after beating the boss and gaining the spell, I decided to consult the guide once again, because it was saying that it had one of the character's final weapons and he was the only one I was missing one for. But then I remembered, oh no, oh Clemps, you silly fucking penis. In your haste, you neglected to do more research, because the guide you were using left out the crucial piece of information that told you the weapon is part of a treasure hunt. A unique side quest where talking to NPCs or discovering secrets in the world will give you a clue and a locator on the minimap once you find the correct area. This wasn't the worst thing in the world at this point because I assumed there would be a teleport back to the start of a dungeon. I was wrong. The game expects you to exit the dungeon by completing each room backwards. Whilst it might be slightly easier, it isn't any less tedious. When I would stop consulting the guide, I would simply get lost once again. But as I said earlier, I'm just happy this is optional instead of being the final dungeon or something, because I can easily see people dropping it there if that was the case. And that's the end of the gameplay segment, which means we rejoin our party right as they savagely beat a worm to death, freeing Grandstaff from any future leaks. However, shortly after we dispatch the source of the problem, we're immediately met with another, this time in the form of an entire military brigade from the city of Numara, and they don't buy our excuse that we're just 3 tourists. We try to escape after Seth orders Jansen to ignite the pipes on what is effectively a giant nuclear reactor, which is, you know, a choice.
I think there's graphite on the ground.
You didn't see graphite.
You didn't!
But it turns out this bold move was in service of absolutely nothing, as they're captured and thrown straight into custody aboard the White Boa, a royal Numaran vessel that has the Queen riding aboard as well. The man who arrested us, General Kakanus, serves as the mouthpiece of Her Majesty, but it's clear that as of right now, she simply serves as a figurehead of the kingdom instead of a true ruler. We get another scene where Kaim deviates from his archetype, admitting that his dreams scare him. Each night they keep getting progressively more vivid, which implies his memories might be returning to him. Something he is actively fighting against, which Seth believes is an unhealthy path to take. Abandoning your memories as someone who can't die is as good as burying the person you once were. Seth is a good counter against Kaim during these early parts of the game, as her method of tackling her amnesia is to keep moving forward no matter what, not allowing her grief to anchor her in one place, and this definitely has her clashing with Kaim a couple of times in regards to how he's currently choosing to deal with things. Jansen, on the other hand, would rather be catching up with the latest funny meme compilations and has no time to spend his glory days locked up in a prison cell with the anime grandparents. So he uses the logic of, well, if Kaim doesn't want to reclaim his memories, maybe using this thing on him is kinda pointless, and throws it at the prison guard instead, releasing us into a short Metal Gear Solid stealth segment before we come across a door that makes Jansen very excited indeed. For you see, Jansen's highly problematic ears and nose can tactically lock onto any woman within a 5-mile radius, and the one behind this door has caused his tiny monkey brain to go into critical overload. Ming Numara, otherwise known as the Immortal Queen, is yet another amnesiac we meet on our adventure. And at this point, we can definitively say that it's no coincidence that immortals are the one being targeted with this condition. Seth lets Kaim know that, just like him, some of her memories have been returning as well. And coincidentally, one of those memories includes her friendship with Ming. A few hundred years ago, they encountered each other on the open sea back when Seth was still a pirate. But instead of getting her thrown behind bars, she invited her to the palace. There, she and Ming spent hours exchanging stories of her adventures on the high seas to beating up pirates that stepped out of line. And the entire time, Ming would treat Seth as if they'd known each other their entire lives, constantly asking for more stories as Seth would laugh for what felt like the first time in years. Afterwards, without even needing to rob it from her, Ming would gift a royal heirloom as proof of their friendship, asking for its safe return when they next met. But when Seth looks back at it now and the way the Queen would always push for more stories, she feels it was Ming trying to taste some of the freedom that Seth experienced, to be unshackled from the duties of a queen, if only for a few hours. Interrupting this touching backstory is our smelly little friend Jansen, who, ever the unpredictable one, swoops into Ming's private quarters with the grace of a used car salesman covered in slime, and proceeds to go against the script and knocks Ming the fuck out, kidnapping her in the process.
Wild card, bitches!
Keep in mind, he came up with this decision on the fly, so Kaim and Seth are left to fight back against the Numaran forces whilst Jansen slips out of her back with his royal hostage. There he sees a bird having a particularly bad Monday and helps it escape, which is very symbolic. This leads to Ming revealing that she was never actually knocked out, petrifying his legs in place whilst revealing that she could move further up if she wanted to, thus effectively holding his penis hostage. Jansen's extremely baffling explanation boils down to, that guy doesn't respect you. He's using you. I am merely ferrying you away from this toxic person, releasing you into the wild, so to speak. And Ming is like, I am the queen? I can't be doing that, you Melvin. But due to the whole bird incident, she can see that he's not a person with inherent evil intentions. So she releases the Glock from his cock and shockingly releases the entirety of the party into the city of Numara. This choice has two different political stances involved, however. You see, Ming has created the nation of Numara by going down the path of isolationism. Numara, being an isolationist nation, does not engage in the politics of other countries. And if these three are either Uran spies or Uran tourists who coincidentally wanted to take a closer look at the leaking nuclear reactor, it doesn't matter. Show them that peace is the only thing that reigns in Numara. On the flip side, we have General Kakanus, a young man who also values peace and is willing to keep it through means of extreme acts of violence, war crimes where none are spared, be they man, woman or child, because when every country is flying the Numaran banner, they will have no choice but to accept their peace-loving ways. They will sit the world down and peace down their throats. If this sounds hyperbolic, it's kinda close to how the game game paints it actually, it's a little bit comical.
This new regime must be created for the sake of world peace. We shall spread your majesty's teachings, using our nation's military might. No, the Grand Staff should not be in the hands of those simple-minded fools in Ura. We Numarans should control it. Then we can use it to maintain peace all over the world. Numara would become the most powerful, peace-loving country in the world!
So with our 3 heroes released into the city, and against the wishes of the Queen, Kakanis orders that the party are closely observed to discover exactly when and how these Uran spies reveal their trickery. Because my man is storing a plentiful bounty of peace deep inside his body pockets, and all he can see are 3 thirsty little flowers, gasping to be watered. So with our newfound freedom and unknowingly being tracked by the Good Vibes Goblin, we explore the city and take in the sights, only to find ourselves in a section of the city that is noticeably more run down than the rest of Numara. Here we stumble upon 2 children tending to a patch of flowers named Tenderflora, a rare plant that never wilts and is said to bring happiness, at least according to the children's mother. Seth takes a moment to talk to the kids because she's a genuinely good person, Jansen attempts to end this child's whole career because he's genuinely Jansen, and Kaim can't seem to keep his eyes off the Tenderflora. Even as the conversation continues and banter is exchanged, Kaim continues to keep his eyes fixed on the flowers, until a memory comes bursting into his head, expanding one of his memories, which was previously nothing but a dream, into something more tangible. He remembers the Tenderflora were present during this traumatic event, Seth jumping to her friend's side when she notices the telltale signs of his memory returning. This is interrupted by a bunch of city guards populated entirely by school bullies who attempt to pick the flowers. They also attempt to end this child's whole career, so we end theirs instead, leading to these children, named Cook and Mac, bringing us to meet their mother to show her the heroes who saved them. Upon entering, it's clear to everyone that their mother is dangerously sick, unable to even stand. Cook and Mac introduce the trio as not just their saviors, but the Tenderfloras too. As she turns her head to look upon her children and new guest, her eyes fix on Kaim for a moment, until realization dawns. With an outstretched arm, she claims that the flowers brought them back together, and it's this that causes Kaim's memory to come flooding back with such force it brings him to his knees. This woman is Lirim, Kaim's daughter, someone who, up until now, was presumed dead by taking her own life as a little girl. This reunion, however, is fleeting. By this point, she'd been hanging on for far too long, knowing Cook and Mac would be without a guardian to protect them. But now, maybe due to the joy of meeting her father one final time and knowing he'd take care of his grandchildren, she passes away. Kaim lamenting that he'd only just found her again. He had only just remembered she existed in the first place. But whilst mourning for his long-lost daughter, another emotion is mixed in with the heartbreak. Rage. With his memory now returned to him, he can clearly see that another figure was standing by Lirim, and it was this figure that manipulated her into doing what she did. The family members have tears in their eyes when they welcome Kaim back to the inn from his long journey. Thank you so much for coming. He understands the situation immediately. The time for departure is drawing near. I might never see you again, she said to him with a sad smile when he left on this journey, her smiling face almost transparent in its whiteness, so fragile and therefore indescribably beautiful as she lay in bed. May I see Hanna now? He asks. The innkeeper gives him a tiny nod and says, I don't think she'll know who you are though. She hasn't opened her eyes since last night, he warns Kaim. You can tell from the slight movement of her chest that she's clinging to a frail thread of life, but it could snap at any moment. Kaim puts his arm around the woman's shoulder and says, I have lots of travel stories to tell her. I've been looking forward to this my whole time on the road. Instead of smiling, the woman releases another large tear and nods to Kaim. And Hanna was so looking forward to hearing your stories. Her sobs almost drown out her words. There is very little time left. Hanna, the only daughter of the innkeeper and his wife, will probably breathe her last before the sun comes up. Hanna was frail from birth. Far from enjoying the opportunity to travel, she rarely left the town or even the neighborhood in which she was born and raised. Hanna was unable to go anywhere, but the guests who stayed at her parents' inn would tell her stories of the countries and towns and landscapes and people that she would never know. Whenever new guests arrived at the inn, Hanna would ask them, "Where are you from? Where are you going? Can you tell me a story?" She would sit and listen to their stories with sparkling eyes, urging them on to new episodes with, "And then? And then?" When they left the inn, she would beg them, "Please come back and tell me lots and lots of stories about faraway countries." She would stand there waving until the person disappeared far down the highway, give one lonely sigh, and go back to bed. Hanna is sound asleep. No one else is in the room, perhaps an indication that she's long since passed the stage when the doctors can do anything for her. Clemps sits down in the chair next to the bed and says with a smile, "Hello, Hanna. I'm back. I went far across the ocean this time," he tells her. "The ocean on the side where the sun comes up. I took a boat from the harbour way, way, way far beyond the mountains you can see from this window. And I was on the sea from the time the moon was perfectly round till it got smaller and smaller, then bigger and bigger until it was full again. There was nothing but ocean as far as the eye could see. Just the sea and the sky. Can you imagine it, Hanna? You've never seen the ocean, but I'm sure people have told you about it. It's like a huge, big, endless puddle." Clemps chuckles to himself, and it seems to him that Hanna's pale white cheek moves slightly. She can hear him. Even if she cannot speak or see, her ears are still alive. Believing and hoping this to be true, Clemps continues with the stories of his travels. As always with Hanna, Clemps smiles with a special gentleness he's never shown to anyone else, and he goes on telling his tales with a bright voice, sometimes even accompanying his story with exaggerated gestures. He tells her about the blue sky. He says nothing about the violent sea battle that stained the ocean red. He never tells her about those things. Hanna was still a tiny girl when Clemps first visited the inn. He was spiritually worn down back then and feeling unbearably lonely. As a possessor of eternal life, Clemps had no fear of death, which was precisely why each of the soldiers' faces distorted in fear, and why each face of a man who died in agony was burned permanently into his brain. Ordinarily, he would spend nights on the road drinking, immersing himself in an alcoholic stupor, or pretending to. He was trying to make himself forget the unforgettable. When, however, he saw Hanna's smile and begged him for stories about his long journey, he felt a far warmer and deeper comfort than he could even obtain from liquor. He told her many things, about the beautiful flower he discovered on the battlefield, about the bewitching beauty of the mist filling the forest the night before the final battle, about the marvellous taste of the spring water in a ravine, where he and his men had fled after losing the battle. He never told her anything sad. He kept his mouth shut about the human ugliness and stupidity he witnessed endlessly during his time on the road. He sees now that he told Hanna only beautiful stories of a road like this, not so much out of concern for her purity, but for his own sake. And now, Clemps ends the last travel story he will share with her. He can never see her again, can never tell her stories again. Before dawn, when the darkness of night is at its deepest, long pauses enter into Hanna's breathing. The frail thread of her life is about to snap as Clemps and her parents watch over her. The tiny light that is lodged in Clemps' breast will be extinguished. His lonely travels will begin again tomorrow. His long, long travels without end. "You'll be leaving on travels of your own soon, Hanna," Clemps tells her gently. "You'll be leaving for a world that no one knows, a world that has never entered into any of the stories you've heard so far. Finally, you'll be able to leave your bed and walk anywhere you want to go. You'll be free. It's your turn now. Be sure and tell everyone about the memories of your journey." Her parents will make that journey someday, and someday, Hanna will be able to meet all the guests she's known at the inn, far beyond the sky. He, however, can never go there. He can never escape this world. He can never see her again. This is not goodbye. It's just the start of your journey. He speaks his final words to her. We'll meet again. His final lie to her. Hanna makes her departure. Her face is transfused with a tranquil smile, as if she's just said, "See you soon." Her eyes will never open again. A single tear glides slowly down her cheek. Bye.